Welcome back to Romantic Musings. I'm Mike.
And I'm Maria, ready for a deep dive into a fascinating story. Love, courage, and fighting for the right to choose. That's what we're talking about today.
We're going back in time, back to the 1880s, to India, to the grand halls of the Bombay High Court, in fact. That's where a young woman named Rukhmabai took a stand that changed history.
What's really compelling about Rukhmabai's story is, well, how it connects these personal desires with huge shifts in society.
Yeah.
It really shows how one person's choices, they can just ripple outwards and create, waves of change.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Rukhmabai was married really young, just 11 years old,
Oh, wow.
to her cousin in a traditional arranged marriage.
This was pretty common practice at the time, but what makes Rukhmabai's story extraordinary is what happened years later when she reached puberty.
Okay.
Her husband expected her to move in with him, and she refused.
Wow, I mean, what a brave decision. What was it about Rukhmabai that made her stand up for herself like that?
Well, she was exposed to some progressive ideas from a young age. Through her stepfather's reformist circle, she also received an education which was unusual for girls in her community at the time.
So she had a taste of a different way of life, a life where she could make her own choices.
Exactly. She had all these dreams and aspirations that went beyond the traditional role of a wife,
I can imagine.
and she was so determined to create her own path.
But I imagine that refusing to live with her husband caused quite a stir around.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Didaju, her husband, understandably, he was upset, took her to court to demand, get this, his conjugal rights.
Oh, wow, that's where things get really interesting. Now, I'm not a legal expert, so can you explain what conjugal rights meant in this context?
Of course. So at the time, the law, it recognized a husband's right to his wife's companionship and, well, intimacy, regardless of her consent.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a real legal battleground for women who, like Rukhmabai, were forced into marriages they didn't want.
So Rukhmabai found herself at the center of this huge legal and societal battle.
She did. And you know what? She didn't back down. She used her voice, writing letters to the Times of India under a pseudonym, a Hindu lady.
Wow, so she was kind of using the power of the press to fight back.
She was. And these letters sparked a nationwide debate about women's rights, the whole practice of child marriage.
So she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was speaking for a whole generation of young women.
Precisely. And her courage, it caught the attention of some really important people like Baramji Malabari and Pandita Ramabai. They were social reformers already advocating for women's rights.
So they saw in her a symbol of this much larger movement.
Absolutely. They rallied to support her, formed a whole defense committee to help her through this incredibly challenging legal battle.
That's amazing how people came together to champion her cause.
It really is. And think about it, this was over a century ago. One woman's courage sparked a national conversation.
And it even reached international shores, right? I remember reading that a famous Indologist named Max Muller even weighed in on the case.
Oh, you're right. Max Muller, a German scholar who dedicated his whole life to studying Indian culture and history, he was fascinated by Rukhmabai's case.
So even back then, these issues of women's rights and individual choice were resonating across continents.
Exactly. It shows that Rukhmabai's story wasn't just a local issue. It touched on these universal themes of freedom, autonomy, stuff that resonated with people all over the world.
It's incredible how one woman's stand could have such far-reaching consequences.
It is, and the case itself dragged on for years, putting Rukhmabai under immense pressure. Can you imagine the strength it took to withstand that kind of scrutiny?
It must have been so challenging, but it sounds like she never wavered in her conviction.
She didn't. She held her ground, knowing that this fight was about something much, much bigger than herself.
So what ultimately happened? Did she win?
Well, in a way, yes. Eventually, Dadaji opted for an out-of-court settlement. The legal costs, the negative attention, it all became too much.
So even though it wasn't a complete victory, legally speaking, it was a huge personal triumph for Rukhmabai.
Exactly. It was a declaration of her freedom and a testament to her courage in the face of, well, overwhelming odds.
It's amazing how she used this experience to propel herself forward. I understand she went on to have a pretty incredible career.
You're absolutely right. But we'll delve into that fascinating part of her story in the next part of our deep dive.
We left off with Rukhmabai winning her freedom after that long court battle. And it's inspiring to see how she turned this whole challenging experience into a springboard for an amazing life.
It really is, and her story, it gets even more fascinating when you think about the impact it had on society as a whole. So the attention that her case got, it helped push forward a significant legal reform. The Age of Consent Act of 1891.
Oh, right. That act, that raised the age of consent for marriage in India, didn't it?
It did. It was a huge step towards protecting, well, young girls from being forced into marriage before they were really ready, physically and emotionally. Before the act, the age of consent was just 10 years old.
10 years old. That's shockingly young. So Rukhmabai's case directly contributed to this change.
Yes, her case, it kind of served as this catalyst, bringing this whole issue of child marriage to the forefront of public debate.
It's incredible how one person's struggle can create this kind of ripple effect.
But it's also important to remember that progress, it isn't always a straight line, you know? The Age of Consent Act, it faced a lot of resistance, especially from those who saw it as an attack on tradition, on cultural autonomy.
So even though this act was meant to protect young girls, it created a lot of tension, a lot of controversy.
Exactly. Some people, particularly those with more traditional views, they saw the act as, an example of the British imposing their values on Indian society.
Yeah.
They felt that the British were interfering with Hindu customs and undermining their whole way of life.
That makes sense. It must have been such a complex and delicate situation trying to balance the need for reform with the sensitivities of, different cultural groups.
Absolutely.
Ah.
It highlights how even well-intentioned changes can have unintended consequences and spark these huge debates.
It's a good reminder that progress is rarely simple.
Huh.
Rarely a linear process.
Right.
It often involves navigating, well, these really complex cultural and social landscapes.
Exactly. And the debate surrounding the Age of Consent Act, it really showcases these complexities.
So we have this fascinating, clash of perspectives. On one hand, you have Rukhmabai and her supporters who saw the act as a victory for women's rights.
Right.
And on the other hand, you have these traditionalists who saw it as a threat to their cultural identity.
Precisely. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, a prominent nationalist leader at the time, he was one of the most vocal critics of the act.
I'm not familiar with Tilak. Can you tell us a bit more about him?
Sure. He was a key figure in the Indian independence movement. He believed that social reform should come from within Indian society, not be imposed by the British.
Okay.
He argued that the act was just another way for the British to exert control, to undermine Indian culture.
So he saw it as this kind of power struggle between the colonizers and the colonized.
Yeah, and he believed that focusing on social reforms like the Age of Consent Act, that it was a distraction from the larger goal of achieving independence.
That's a really interesting point. It adds another layer of complexity to this whole story.
It does. It shows how different social and political movements, they can sometimes clash, even when they share this common goal of improving people's lives.
Yeah, it also highlights how important it is to consider different perspectives, right? To understand the historical context when you're evaluating social change.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that history, it's never black and white, right? There are always nuances, complexities, and multiple viewpoints to consider.
So we have these contrasting viewpoints on the Age of Consent Act. How did the public react to this whole debate?
The public response was it was incredibly divided. Newspapers were full of letters, editorials, both supporting and opposing the act. Public figures, religious leaders, ordinary citizens, everyone weighed in. It was a true national conversation.
It sounds like the whole country was grappling with these questions of tradition versus modernity, individual rights versus societal norms.
It was a pivotal moment in Indian history, a time when, the foundations of society were being questioned, redefined.
And in the midst of all this, you have Rukhmabai, this one woman who, through her own personal struggle, ignited this national debate about women's rights and the role of law in shaping social change.
Exactly. Her story, it became this lightning rod attracting attention from all corners of society. It forced people to confront these difficult questions.
It's a testament to the power of individual action.
Right.
She didn't set out to change the world, but her fight for her own freedom, it had these incredible ripple effects that continue to resonate today.
It really shows how one person's courage can inspire change on this grand scale.
Wow.
But what's even more inspiring is how Rukhmabai used her newfound freedom to pursue her passions and build a remarkable life. But that is a story for the final part of our deep dive.
So we saw how Rukhmabai fought for her freedom and the ripple effects it had. But what did she do with that freedom?
Well, she made an incredible choice. She decided to pursue medicine.
Oh, wow.
A field that, back then was dominated by men, especially in India.
Yeah, what an incredible choice. What do you think drew her to medicine?
I think if you remember, she had been exposed to those progressive ideas, especially through her stepfather. And while she always valued education.
Right, and she had mentioned, like, her desire to learn and grow in those letters to the Times of India.
Exactly. It seems like medicine really combined her intellectual curiosity with that desire to make a difference.
Yeah, but becoming a doctor back then, especially for a woman in India, I mean, that couldn't have been easy at all.
Oh, you're absolutely right. She faced so many obstacles, the societal pressures, limited opportunities, even outright discrimination.
It's hard to imagine how challenging that must have been for her.
But Rukhmabai, well, she wasn't one to back down. She had this unwavering determination, pursued her studies, and earned her medical degree.
So she became a doctor, shattering those glass ceilings and just, defying those societal expectations.
She did. And she didn't stop there. She became one of the first practicing female doctors in India. Can you imagine the impact she had on her patients, especially the women who may have never seen a female doctor before?
That's amazing.
It's truly awe-inspiring. Her story shows that resilience, it isn't just about overcoming adversity. It's about using those experiences to move forward, break those boundaries, and inspire others.
Absolutely. It really is a testament to, well, the power of the human spirit to turn those challenges into opportunities and make a difference in the world.
I completely agree.
Rukmabai's story, it's about so much more than her own achievements. It's a story with a lasting legacy, you know.
You're right. Her fight for freedom of choice, her groundbreaking career, it all paved the way for so many women in India and beyond.
She became this symbol of empowerment, this example that, well, that women could challenge those norms and really reach their full potential.
And over a century later, her story still resonates, inspiring these movements for equality and women's rights all around the world.
It's a good reminder that the fight for equality is this ongoing journey, like a relay race, where each generation kind of builds on the progress of those that came before.
I love that analogy. Rukhbai's courage, it ignited this flame that continues to burn brightly, inspiring us all to keep pushing those boundaries, advocating for a just and equitable world.
This has been an incredible journey exploring Rukmabai's captivating story. Her story really reminds us of the power of just one voice to spark change, the resilience of the human spirit, and the importance of fighting for freedom and equality.
If you want to dive deeper into Rukhmabai's extraordinary life, you can find a detailed article on www.mysunday.love.
It's a story you won't soon forget.
Thanks for joining us on Romantic Musings. Until next time, keep those hearts open and those minds curious.